Many owners believe that during wartime they need to take control over the company themselves. If the board is truly capable, then, as they say in Western Ukraine, it's a blessing. We got together over a beer with partners, talked about business, and, well, that's almost a board meeting.
Our board is run by our own rules.
Not all companies can attract reputable board members. The driving force behind improvements in corporate governance is the need for funding.
A new segment of this market is emerging. It's a municipal enterprises segment.
Lviv Vodokanal has established a board. I heard that, yes, it got good feedback.
If we look ahead over the next 15 years, what will corporate governance in Ukraine look like?
It will involve huge amounts of money in serious tenders.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the channel. Boards of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin. Today we continue our conversation with Oleksandr Okuniev, and today we will focus on boards of directors and on corporate governance, its development in Ukraine and its current state. Oleksandr, basically, what is corporate governance in general? And why is it critical for the development of the economy as a whole and businesses in particular?
I would put it more simply. Corporate governance is what an owner should do in relation to their business. It is generally accepted that, as a rule, the elements of corporate governance include the strategic process as a whole. In particular, ensuring the strategic process, approval procedures of the strategy, monitoring its implementation, making adjustments, and so on. The main thing is the strategic process. Second, finding and hiring the right CEOs, assessment, evaluating their performance, matters of compensation, management, oversight, and control, and establishing various levels of control and audit, and probably also the relationships with the company's stakeholders. These are the four main areas, I believe. This is what the owner or the supervisory board, acting in their interest, should be responsible for, as opposed to the day-to-day operations of the company, which should be handled by the top management.
How does this help in our current reality, in the reality of war? How does this help companies become more resilient, have business continuity plans, and be better prepared for the challenges that exist today?
By the way, not everyone agrees with you that corporate governance or some kind of complex corporate governance model helps a company during wartime. Many owners believe that during wartime they need to take control of the company into their own hands and get rid of what they consider unnecessary structures like the supervisory board and so on. Well, in reality, in most cases, this is actually a mistake. It is only not a mistake if the board is inefficient. If the board is efficient, then it is a mistake. And I think that sooner or later they come to realize this. And now what we are seeing is that at the beginning of the war, there was, as they say, a decrease in the number of boards, a decline in board activity. In most companies, there was a return of owners directly to company management. Now we are seeing the opposite processes, and it seems to me that the owners have realized that this was a mistaken belief. If the board is truly capable, then of course it is a quite helpful and useful matter, and here 100%. So how can it help? Of course, it's experience, it's, if you will, mental support for the management. Because in such a crisis situation, it's hard to be left all alone with the problems, especially since the problems are extraordinary, and that's obvious. And when, including the management, anyone understands that there's someone nearby, someone smart, someone brave, someone confident in the company's success, that, of course, is inspiring and helpful.
What challenges are arising now during the war for supervisory boards and advisory boards?
First of all, many men have gone to war. Unfortunately, quite a lot of them already have not returned and will not return. Never. This is a challenge, including for the boards as well. And we see that many women are now taking leadership positions in companies. And well, by the way, we have a large program to support women and their training as members of supervisory boards, their professional development, and this is an important initiative. Secondly, of course, there are issues related to communication, traveling abroad, the arrival of foreign colleagues here, and companies' export-import operations. So on various levels, the fact that martial law is in effect here naturally has an impact. Here as well, there's no single solution for how to address this, but we have to try to do something about it. Many boards hold meetings outside of Ukraine. A large part of the board's work is being done online, something that wasn't the case before. This is a challenge because, in my opinion, online communication still doesn't replace offline interaction. And yes, of course, some issues can be resolved online, but definitely not all of them, in my opinion. And that's also a serious challenge in the work.
Before the full-scale war began, there was a certain wave of interest from business owners in the implementation of boards. Then, indeed, after the invasion began, many owners took control into their own hands and some closed their boards. But almost immediately, a new wave of interest began to form because after the invasion, a lot of company owners became interested in creating boards because they understand that under the current conditions, it's really difficult for them. They carry a huge responsibility and there is a great deal of uncertainty, and they need, it's absolutely essential for the survival of the business to bring in people with expertise in specific areas that are important for the company. On the other hand, when talking to company owners, I often get the impression, a hypothesis, that there's a lot of irrationality in this interest, like a trend. Many business owners are interested in this subject simply because it's becoming almost fashionable. What do you think?
Absolutely. On the one hand, it's great that this trend exists. After all, people are paying attention to this tool, and in doing so, they're pushing the market forward. On the other hand, anything is being called a board these days. We get together over a beer with partners, talk about business, and that's already almost considered a board. Still, I believe that a board is not just a group of people, a collection of knowledge, but also procedures. Even an advisory board still involves procedures, because if you're doing something according to a certain scenario, then it's a process. But if you're just meeting from time to time and chatting, that's something else entirely. A friendly get-together. Secondly, I'll tell you this, it depends on the people. Well, the success of the board primarily is in its composition. And this is an important point, that there is a proper composition of the board directors, the right group of people. I've heard many times from business owners, we tried having a board and it didn't work out for us. And who was on the board? Oh, the board consisted of my friends, acquaintances, business colleagues, and partners. And were they experienced board members? No, they never were. That's why you didn't really have a board. You just had some gatherings of respectable, good people, but it wasn't a board. So here we need to be clear about the terminology. I think that this is still quite rare. Nowadays, it's rare to see a properly formed, high-quality board made up of competent people with proper procedures. Only then can we talk about its effectiveness or ineffectiveness. But when people gather like amateurs, that's still not a real board. In my opinion...
Very interesting. You've mentioned advisory boards. But to what extent are they part of corporate governance?
That's an interesting story, and honestly, my perspective on it was changing over time. Because if you had asked me about this 5 years ago, I would have said, well, yes, that's exactly how boards develop in the company. First, there's an advisory board, and then it becomes a supervisory board as a governing body that makes decisions. And while it's still advisory, it consults the owner or maybe gives advice to them. And one evolves out of the other. As I see it now, I believe these are different things. And one doesn't always evolve out of the other. And I'll go even further and say that if a company has an advisory board, it will actually be harder for it to later establish a supervisory board. Because after all, it's a slightly different game. The story is, when we advise the owner on something, he discusses certain business development issues with us, his own business, we give him advice, and he either follows it or doesn't. Ideally, by the way, to keep a track record of what we advised, what he implemented, and what the outcome was. But still, these are just recommendations, and ultimately the responsibility lies on the owner, and his decisions are final. As for the supervisory board, it's a governing body, it carries responsibility, and decisions are made by majority vote, with the owner having one vote. You have to trust the people you've brought onto the board, and in return, the board members must bear responsibility for the decisions they make. And I think these are different procedures, different matters, and different people are needed for those boards. It seems that the business advisory board is still about business, about strategy, about business development. And in the supervisory board, the powers are broader. This includes oversight, hiring the CEO, assessment of the CEO. These are broader powers. It requires a different set of people for this role. At least that's how I see it.
If we talk about implementing boards, Many businesses are not ready to implement a supervisory board right away. It's no secret that we see many companies with a legal structure that makes it practically impossible to introduce a supervisory board into the charter of any of the legal entities within that structure, because essentially it's an entirely chaotic legal structure. Or there are other reasons why a supervisory board cannot be implemented right away. The owner or top management, as a rule, cannot independently bring the company to a state that is ready for the implementation of a supervisory board. In any case, they need some experts, consultants, some advice, theoretically including the advisory board.
Well, I would break this down this question into two parts. First, regarding the legal aspects of formalizing the board's activities within the company. I'm a lawyer myself, so I basically understand that everyone wants it to be perfectly and legally regulated. But I would say that at the initial stage, maybe it's not necessary. Doing that at the beginning, basically, if it's a private company and everyone knows each other, then you can agree on how to start working and make decisions in the way outlined by the charter. But to develop and adopt those decisions through more informal procedures. To regulate it now, perhaps in principle, the law allows for the creation of boards in LLC charters, so technically it's possible, but I wouldn't start with that. I would still start with the essence, whether there is actual board activity to legalize or maybe there isn't. The second issue you mentioned is that, on the one hand, the owners are afraid to hand over full control of the company to other people. Well, even if they are recommended, respected, and well-known individuals, from the owner's perspective, they're still strangers. So there are such concerns, and I think they have some reasons. That is why our project, our board test drive, which we talked about previously, might actually be appropriate. In 6 months, you'll understand whether this person can be trusted. That's the first point. Second, we always forget that it's not only the owner who chooses a board member, but the board member also chooses the company. Of course, board members, if they are professionals, this is not just a type of activity for them. So they highly value their own reputation, what they are offering, their professional reputation, integrity, honesty, and so on. And the companies they are involved with matter to them. Respected board members do not agree to join just any company. Well, let's be honest, many companies also have issues with taxation. Certain, how should I put it, complicated relationships. Board members would not want to be involved in any of those stories involving optimization, tax schemes, and so on. So the company, yes, really needs to prepare in a certain way for the creation of the board, the implementation of such modern corporate governance. On the other hand, sometimes people also tell me, let's do this, and this, and then elect the board. I say, and all of that which comes before, who will do it, under whose leadership? To me, the creation of the board is still one of the initial stages. And then the board will determine how to implement other changes. There's no need to over-prepare for the creation of the board. You see, there are two different things here. On one hand, preparation is needed. On the other hand, the board should lead the changes. Take it however you like.
We've just discussed it, the current state and the nuances that arise in private companies when establishing boards. If we assess the state of board operations in state-owned companies, in companies where boards are required by Ukrainian law, what is the current situation?
We have some idea of the situation. Everyone knows the story with Naftogaz. Everyone knows the story with Ukrainian. Everyone knows the high-profile cases. I don't know of a state-owned company where I've been on the board that hasn't had a scandal. Well, almost none. There's always something going on. What does that tell us? It tells us that at the top there is still no real understanding of what corporate governance is. There is a desire to, how should I put it, create the impression that we have corporate governance. There is a desire, well, sort of, to make it look like we have boards and so on. In reality, the fact that boards have been established, well, first of all, they haven't been created in all large state-owned companies, far from all of them. Secondly, even where they have been established, so what then? How do they function? Who evaluates them? Only just now has a procedure for evaluating the boards been approved, an external evaluation of the activities of the supervisory board. So I think that according to the rules for 2024, I believe we'll get one or two. Well, the Cabinet of Ministers decided there will be 3 companies, Naftogaz, Ukrainian, and one more company. Their boards will be evaluated, how effective they are, and so on. We'll see what they write to us. But overall, we don't have a state body that evaluates boards. One that is responsible for forming boards and communicating their tasks to them. That is, right now, the Cabinet of Ministers seems to be making some decisions, but still, the Cabinet of Ministers is the Cabinet of Ministers. And there is no specific agency, no dedicated state body. So it seems to me that in the public sector, for now, what's happening is, well, how to put it, you know that joke, do you want the checkers or the ride? It seems to me that for now, it's just the checkers.
Including when it comes to dependent members of supervisory boards who are appointed to the boards by the Cabinet of Ministers.
Well, that's a complete blind spot, because when it comes to selecting independent directors, at least there's some kind of procedure in place. You can argue whether it's effective or not, but at least there is one. As for the procedure of appointing those directors who represent the state, well, it's a complete blind spot. And I believe that there should be selection procedures for them as well. These people, yes, they may be from the Cabinet of Ministers, from a ministry or an agency, but they should possess a set of qualities to be directors, not just, how to put it, I conduct trainings, sometimes there are various exams, and someone once told me I passed the exam. A person from the State Property Fund, of course, I won't name him, and it was a long time ago, but here's an example. The person says, and I'm also on supervisory boards. I say, oh, interesting, which companies? He says, there are 9 of them, I don't remember them all. That's how people work on boards. So at that point, it was what it was. What is there to talk about? I think that there has to be a selection process, but on the other hand, those officials who are on the boards, they don't receive any compensation. Well, to me, that's also an issue. Any kind of work should be rewarded financially. Otherwise, no one takes it seriously. And I think that's also a problem that needs to be addressed.
Some experts claim that boards of directors in state-owned companies, especially in state-owned companies, function more as a formality. Some delve into strategy and other strategic matters, but mostly the work is done formally. I agree. On the other hand, for instance, supervisory boards that are established as required by law, for example, in banks, we can't say that many of them function properly and effectively either.
When it comes to banks and financial companies, I think that there might be the same problem in state-owned ones, but it's caused by something a bit different. I think that the regulator, in the form of the national bank, is a bit, how to put it, overdoing it in terms of regulation and oversight. That is, again, understandable that they prioritize formal procedures. They check absolutely everything, verify, document, and conduct interviews. Before appointments, they approve all position assignments, and so on. It seems to me that these are still mostly formal procedures. I know many executives whose candidates were not approved for board positions, even though they clearly deserved it. And on the contrary, I know many people who were approved for board positions, but they definitely are not the officiaries. There are people who went through these procedures, but that doesn't mean anything. And there are many requirements from the regulator. Everything that involves the word risks, the national bank requires to be decided by the supervisory board. And because of that, banks sometimes say they have 50 board meetings a year. I ask, what for? They say, well, we have to comply with regulations, so we're forced to do it in order to meet all the requirements, to hold a bunch of meetings and so on. Everyone understands that this isn't really necessary, so there it seems to me, this is a sign of stronger pressure from the regulator, which leads to this kind of overkill towards the hyperactivity of supervisory boards. Although it must be acknowledged that the supervisory boards in banks today are well structured and functioning. People's expertise is growing, and that's a good thing, I agree. But there's a bit of excess in this.
Including many members of supervisory boards or specialists in bank corporate governance, do they actually study, do they take the corporate director course?
Yes, they do study, and let me mention that we are planning to incorporate into our summer learning dedicated modules for representatives of banks and financial companies, for representatives of state-owned companies, and for representatives of private companies. So they all study together, but for 1 or maybe 2 days they will study separately to go over some specific issues for banks, state-owned companies, and private companies. I think this will improve, the quality of the programs. Actually, we've had many representatives from banks go through our training programs, and many banks have ordered corporate trainings. We conducted them for the entire management team of the bank. And yes, the feedback was positive.
Right now, there's actually a wave of inquiries and interest from private business owners in creating boards. On the other hand, a new segment of this market is emerging. It's the municipal enterprises. This segment is very large. And with proper corporate governance in such companies, it will definitely be more efficient, which will benefit citizens, communities, and the state. And at what stage is this process by now?
Thank you for the question. Well, actually, it has been like that all along. Municipal sector is like a child without a parent in terms of corporate governance. Look, state-owned enterprises boards are defined at the legislative level. For banks, they are regulated by laws, but for municipal, they are not. It's not prohibited, but it's also not required by law. And for a long time, these companies remained like in the Soviet Union, a municipal enterprise with a director, a chief accountant, and the owner is the city hall. And the city hall is also a heterogeneous entity with its own internal currents. I would say that the management was in a kind of vacuum in terms of oversight, in terms of support for them. At the same time, municipal enterprises are often large companies employing thousands of people, with large budgets and so on. That's why I think it's a major drawback, or let's say misstep, that the municipal sector was deprived of proper corporate governance. Now the situation is starting to change a bit. Fortunately, it's changing from the bottom up. So local councils already begin to understand the need to strengthen the management level specifically for these companies and are even starting to set up boards on their own. Well, not entirely on their own. We help however we can. And well, we know that, yes, Lviv Vodokanal has established a board. The city created the board and prepared the legal framework. For that, they created a board. The board is functioning, and I've heard, yes, good feedback. Now, a similar trend is happening at the Mykolaiv Vodokanal. We're more involved there, helping the city to establish a board. I believe it will be a strong board and a great support for the water utility company. I think 2 or 3 more boards will be created. If they are successful, this trend will spread very quickly.
Is it possible to expand this trend not just towards water utility companies?
Let's put it this way. We haven't mentioned yet that the driving force behind improvements in corporate governance is the need for money. And it's necessary to create an atmosphere of trust in the company so that everyone from the outside, those who invest money, understand that all is honest, all is under control and guaranteed. That the money will be spent professionally and on what is actually needed for a company. Money can come in different forms. We're used to thinking of investments as something aimed at generating profit, right? But now it can also be large sums in the form of aid. These are international funds, international financial organizations, and of course they also want to have someone to talk to within the company, right? And to be certain that everything is under control, that there are serious people overseeing the process. It all stems from that. Why water utility companies? Because during the war, especially in Mykolaiv, there are major challenges related to water supply. And thankfully, there is a number of donors who are ready to support Mykolaiv in such difficult times and allocate funds. But naturally, there need to be some control, some procedures, and so on. I know that Mykolaiv trolleybus will be next, most likely. Lviv Lighting Company will most likely be next. I know that the Zhytomyr trolleybus is working with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I think that sooner or later, this approach will spread to other municipal enterprises.
Of course, boards of directors, supervisory boards, they will be very important for issues related to the reconstruction of infrastructure, the rebuilding of enterprises, businesses, including in Ukraine after the coming peace. In your opinion, how important will this trend and the involvement of boards of directors be in this process?
I think there will be a surge of interest in Ukraine in general, in the reconstruction of Ukraine, in Ukrainian business, in natural resources in Ukraine. And of course, all of this will be institutionalized through the investment process, through the creation and management of these companies. Well, and I think, yes, there will be interest in the boards as well. Another issue, a challenge for Ukraine both during the war and in peacetime, is that there is no domestic stock market, no companies listed on the stock exchange, and companies are not raising money through the exchange. There are no institutions for collective investment. They do exist, but only a few. There is no serious trend toward investing, and it is precisely this necessitates the creation of a board. A board is a tool for building and increasing trust in a company, for managing a company with multiple owners, but when there is no stock exchange, no investments, then the board's usefulness is then limited, so perhaps that's why it isn't created. Therefore, interest in companies and the money that will hopefully appear on the stock market will naturally drive interest in the board.
We've just discussed the trends related to the current situation, the war, and its conclusion. And if we look at the global trends in corporate governance, there are currently many different directions. Some of them are relatively new and unfamiliar to traditional corporate governance, yet they are becoming popular. For example, it's about greater involvement of boards in the day-to-day operations of the company, when boards are more focused not on oversight, but on control and development, including current processes. Or custom forms of boards. There are even articles on this topic stating that our board is our rule, and accordingly each board is formed according to specific rules, and this somewhat hinders unification, perhaps. On the other hand, it might provide more value to a particular company and its specific business.
Well, let's start from the end about custom boards. Of course, to begin with, you need to define why you need a board at all. What main advantages do you see in it for yourself? If the board's function is to provide guarantees, then it's important that it consists of respected, serious individuals with no reputational issues. They assure everyone else, the surrounding stakeholders, that this company is honest, decent, and won't steal the money but will spend it professionally, honestly, and so on. Then it's one kind of story, and in that case, I wouldn't invent custom boards and so on. If the task is different, just to provide some support to the management, to ensure some strategic innovations for the company. If the company is in some kind of uncertain environment, in an interesting industry where there's rapid development, in science, technology, then of course there should be formats that are convenient for the board, that are comfortable for the board members. And in that case, it's not so important for the board to meet once a quarter, to approve the financial reporting. Now, regarding the board's more involvement, yes, I agree. There was a classic case when the board would be holding a meeting once a quarter, conducting a review of the results for the quarter, outline plans, then decide whether or not to pay bonuses to the management and so on. Well, now that's not like that and is mostly a thing of the past, because there's the possibility to look at reports every evening. And secondly, if you just ignore the quarter, don't look at anything and make no decisions, you could end up with nothing left to manage, because things really do change very quickly. So indeed, there's a trend that the board is more involved, not just meeting once per quarter. Sometimes it's like working in committees. Sometimes it's really a lot of board meetings. It can be structured in different ways, but board members are more engaged in operational work. And here it seems to me our legislation changed very timely. We now have boards of directors introduced in the legislation, not just supervisory boards, but also boards of directors that include both executive and non-executive members. I think this helps foster a better understanding of the board's responsibilities. Well, I would also mention two other important trends. First, I think everyone has noticed this, and I believe it's the right move. Almost every board now includes a professional in digitalization, IT infrastructure, and so on, regardless of the type of company. Look at the banks, for example. There are different kinds of them. Traditional banks, neobanks. So we can already see the direction they're evolving. And they essentially are IT companies. Many retailers have told me, Oleksandr, we're basically IT companies now. Of course, at the strategic level, someone needs to have understanding of these issues and steer the board's discussion in that direction. Of course, it's very important to have a board member with such scope of competencies. The second trend in Europe, it seems to me that last year, 60% of new directors were appointed, on a part-time basis. That is, they combine their role as a CEO of some company or another executive director of a large company and serve on the board of another company. Moreover, I noticed for myself that sometimes it's even, in my opinion, a competing business. And they appoint managers from what is essentially a competing company to their own board. It's quite an interesting trend. On the one hand, it seems kind of risky. On the other hand, we don't trust the personal qualities of a director, then we shouldn't appoint them. If we do trust them, then we rely on them not to disclose any secrets or sensitive data that shouldn't be shared.
Or maybe a strategic partnership is being planned.
Maybe a partnership, maybe a merger. Well, of course. But a very high percentage of current executive directors are now being appointed to boards.
We're used to the American model of building a board of directors, a single-level board, and the two-level board in European companies. Now, many American companies, including those that are listed on stock exchanges, are considering or executing a switch to the European model. What do you think is the reason for this? Will this lead to the American model to be losing its relevance?
Well, I don't think so. At least from my point of view, no, it won't lose relevance. On the contrary, I believe that the trend is just the other way around. Of course, it's like a pendulum. It can definitely swing the other way. Honestly, let me explain. This is about internationalization. Of course, this is such a process. And in America, there are also Germans who manage or who own businesses, and other Europeans who are used to this kind of model. That's normal. I know that in the Republic of South Africa, there are 22 companies listed on the stock exchange. Their legislation allows both one-level and two-level boards. And there, 21 companies have a one-level board and one company has a two-level board. Well, that's the decision they made, and that's what works for them. And there, you see, they respect that kind of practice and allow them to have this two-level model. It seems to me that this trend isn't really tied to some major shift in the modern-day American economy. No, I think it's related to the internationalization of business. And that's it. But the global trend, honestly, even the Germans admit that the American model is more, more effective, more successful, maybe even more suitable. Although for Germany, of course, if 50% of the board members are representatives of the workforce or labor unions, then I think it's simply impossible to operate a classical board of directors. There will be a supervisory board, for sure.
If we look 10, 15 years ahead, eventually the war will end. Investments will start flowing into Ukraine for reconstruction and for the development of enterprise. Of course, supervisory boards and boards of directors will play a certain role in this. In attracting these investments, and if we look at the outlook over these 15 years, what will corporate management in Ukraine look like after this period?
Again, it's about money. Roughly speaking, everyone expects, or at least many people expect, that the war, God willing, will end, and then the money will come, big money, and there will be a chance to earn something and maybe recover the losses suffered during the war. Honestly, I don't think that's how it's going to be. More precisely, the money will come, but there will be a strict selection of those who will manage that money, work with it, and it will be redistributed through tenders. And I think international funds will not be choosing Ukrainian companies on a large scale. I think it will be foreign companies. Why? Because of transparency, because there are guarantees that it will be done honestly, decently, and professionally. Ukrainian companies will be able to compete for this money only if they can prove that they operate honestly, decently, and professionally. Without the supervisory board, it will be really hard to prove that, so I think the role of the board will be crucial. And frankly speaking, I don't think that it will just happen on its own. Ukrainian companies will be receiving huge contracts for this money, because I believe the money won't be given to the government, but rather to some international funds that will be selecting contractors to carry out these works on a market competitive basis. These will be huge amounts of money, serious tenders. And if Ukrainian companies are interested, I think they need to start preparing for this. This includes the creation of councils and improving their operations.
Oleksandr, thank you very much for taking part in today's conversation and for sharing your thoughts on the current state and the prospects of corporate management in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks also to everyone who is watching. On behalf of the association, I want to invite everyone to cooperate. Let's do something together for the profession we all serve.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us on the Board of Directors channel with Sergiy Bulavin. See you in the next episodes.